Well, good afternoon, greetings and salutations. Thank you so much for joining me here today in our study of prophecy, the end times, and the book of Revelation. Today we are going to continue on with what we have been looking at for the past couple of weeks, 3-4 weeks now, in this series that we are looking at currently. This part of this prophecy, end times, and Revelation has been focusing on the book of Ezekiel. Now, next, after we finish the book of Ezekiel, and we're not going through all of the book of Ezekiel, just really chapters 36 through 39. Once we get through with that, we will be moving on to the book of Revelation, although today I am going to tie in some of Revelation. So let's just jump in today and get going on our study. So what we have been looking at is Ezekiel chapters 37 through 39, and really more accurately, what we have been looking at is Ezekiel 36 through 39. And I would encourage you to go through and read all of the book of Ezekiel because there's a lot of prophetic events that are happening through Ezekiel. Look at what God spoke through that time. Essentially, what we have been looking at, though, just as a quick recap, is we have been looking at the nation of Israel from its destruction to its regathering. And really, you could go back several hundred years. You could go back to the time of the Babylonian invasion. So the Babylonian invasion, by the way, that was all spoken about and prophesied about in the book of Jeremiah. So go back and read Jeremiah, and when you read that, you're going to read it through his eyes as a warning to Israel of what's going to come to them. They are going to be attacked from the north. They're going to be taken away into captivity, and that would happen in the Babylonian Empire. Really, from the Babylonian Empire, the nation of Israel would not rule itself again until Israel came back into being in 1948. We looked at the destruction of Israel that happened in 70 AD in the hands of the Romans. The Romans came in and occupied the land. They started in the north, really in 67 AD. And in 67 AD, they came into the north part of Israel, really the region of Galilee. They took over the region of Galilee and they began working their way toward Jerusalem. 70 AD is when Jerusalem fell. All was carried away, all was lost, and at that moment in time, Israel ceased being, and they became known as Palestine. And the Palestine name in the Roman vernacular, the idea of Palestine was wiping Israel away permanently. That's why it's still even known today as Palestine, because the Romans gave it that name in 70 AD. It was wiped away, Israel was no more, Palestine would begin, and the land would lie desolate, and the land essentially would lie in ruins. In fact, interestingly enough, it was in 1867, so in this area, in 1867, Mark Twain actually visited Israel, Palestine. He went to actually the city of Jerusalem in Palestine, and he commented on how much of a desolate wasteland, a place no good. It was good for nothing, is what Mark Twain reported on when he went there and actually saw and visited the land in person. 1867, when that happened, and he wrote those accounts. You can go back and read about them today. They're very interesting to read. Mark Twain's stories that came out of those travels and out of his reporting on this particular land. It was really good for nothing. It wasn't until 1948 then that Israel came back into being. So Israel's rebirth happened in that 1948 time. That's the thing that God was prophesying about. He prophesied about it in Ezekiel's 36 and 37, and this was the dry bones. It was the valley of dry bones. It was bones that were dead and gone who are being brought back to life. And in 36, God specifically says, this is actually what I'm going to do. You're going to be destroyed. You're going to lie in desolate ruins, but I will bring you back. I will bring you back from all corners of the earth. I will bring you back from the lands where you have been scattered. You'll come back. Israel will be reborn like a flower that is going to bloom, and it will go from desolate into a prosperous and wonderful nation. And today, if you look at the nation of Israel, the technology, the agriculture, the society that they have built, there have been incredible advances that have happened No more is it desolate. No more is it in ruins. Now it is rebirthed and it is flourishing in the desert today. So that was the prophecy of the dry bones. The dry bones would come back to life. All of a sudden, Ezekiel saw this valley of dry bones. The tendons, the bones came back together to form skeletons. The skeletons had tendons and muscles and skin covering them, and then God breathed life into it. And that's the ultimate picture of what happened with Israel. Then you have the moment in time of Israel from 1948 really to 1967. And in 1967 is when the Six-Day War happened, and that's when Jerusalem was now back under the control of Israel. And so the restoration of Jerusalem meant that Israel had back all of its land, all that God had promised. And then we saw in 2017 where Donald Trump, in his presidency, he moved the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, and that was a specifically historical prophetic event because that was legitimizing. So it was now legit. It was legitimate. It was being recognized by the most powerful nation in the world that this is Israel has every right to exist, and the Jews have every right to hold that as their land. This is, by the way, this small little piece of land is what most of the world has focused on. The UN has had more resolutions against Israel than any other land, or even I think all lands combined around the world. It has been the center of attention, the center of focus, all of the chaos that happens around there. The hatred by the neighboring Muslim countries toward Israel. Israel is, they believe it's illegitimate. They believe they have no claim to the land. But Israel says, no, we do. This is our home. And so more focus on Israel, this small little piece of land. And God says that this Israel will be the center. He calls it the center of the earth. And this is where everything is focused. It is the center of the earth according to God. God says it is the center of the earth. Everything revolves around Israel. Now we jumped into Israel, to Ezekiel 38, and we begin to see in Ezekiel 38 that the continuation of the timeline is that there is some event in here, some time that there is going to be Israel feeling at peace, then Israel coming under an intense attack. They will be attacked, and they will be attacked by a handful of nations. We know those nations as the beastly empire. It's not a Roman or a European Union revival. It is a Muslim country revival because they are the ones that have the hatred and the animosity. They believe that they have their coming Mahdi that's going to come on the scene. That will be the head of the caliphate that comes on the scene, and there's always talks about that, the revived Ottoman Empire coming back into existence. They believe if that happens, there will be a great leader that will come out of this called the Mahdi, or the Caliph. It is the Muslim Messiah, which really corresponds with our Antichrist. There's some great books and reference materials that you can read about that I can give to you, but we can also go through that later as well to discuss and look at what that looks like. So anyway, when the peace happens, when Israel feels secure, and when they feel at peace, then the Antichrist, the beastly empire, the beast empire, will attack Israel. They will lay waste to Israel, and then that will spring forth the coming of God, the return of Jesus, and it will cause God to intervene. So God will intervene, and he will absolutely step in, and that's where all of the end times. So the end times events are right here. We don't know when the date's going to be, but it sure seems like it's getting closer and closer because you watch the events that are happening in the Middle East and you really understand that these events seem to be coming together. The puzzle seems to be coming together. You have things like I've mentioned that Turkey, which was formerly the Ottoman Empire, Turkey has talked about, their President Erdogan has openly talked about having a revived Ottoman Empire. Now, the Ottoman Empire was the last great Muslim empire, but the revived Ottoman Empire, they believe that that in turn will bring about the Mahdi, which is the Caliph, the leader. That's the Antichrist, likely, will be the head of this revived Ottoman Empire. So you see those events. You see the events in Iran. Iran has this massive hatred of Israel, and almost daily you hear these threats of war from Iran and Israel right back to Iran. You have these threats of war. They're not wanting to attack anybody else. They're wanting to attack Israel. That's the threats that are going on. Pay attention to those. Watch for those events because those are unfolding right before us today. If you add into that the debacle that was Afghanistan, but not just Afghanistan, if you look at all of the Stan nations, Pakistan, Turkmenistan, Afghanistan, all of these Stan nations, Kyrgyzstan, they are all Muslim nations. They all have a hatred toward Israel. So you see these events, the Turkey, Iran, the Stan nations. You see over in Africa, the rising up of these Muslim groups in Afghanistan, or not, I'm sorry, not in Africa, and the rising up of these groups coming toward and coming against Israel. So we are seeing the potential here of the revived empire. Could Israel be at peace? Could they feel secure? Well, absolutely they could. With the Abraham Accords that are going on, that's the nations that are joining together to really have a peaceful relationship with Israel. You see those events happening, but what you will mostly see is once this beastly empire rises up, that the Antichrist or the Caliph of the empire, the confederation of Muslim countries, this person will come up with some kind of a covenant, some kind of a peace agreement with Israel. So that's what you will see. So those two things will set the stage for the real end times events. You will see a covenant of peace with Israel, with the Caliph, who is going to be the Antichrist, in my opinion. There will be this great covenant. You will also see this Abraham Accords, which is going to be another covenant. So what's going to happen is that Israel, at one moment in time, will feel the most secure and the most at peace that they have ever felt. Now, would that lead to the rebuilding of the temple, or would the rebuilding happen before that? I don't know, but it's probably very likely that if they feel at peace, then they feel secure enough to rebuild the temple. If they start rebuilding the temple, now the stage is really being set for these end times events. So we are living in exciting times. We are living in times that you have to be aware of, have to pay attention to, because the events of the end that God lays out are unfolding before us. Now, by the way, God's prophecies in the Bible are the thing, in my opinion, that give the most credence to who God is. We can look around at creation. We can do a lot of apologetics. There's a lot of reasons to believe in God and why God exists. But I believe with everything that I have looked at is that the fulfillment of prophecy, if you look at the prophecies that God has laid out in the Old Testament that have been fulfilled to the letter, those give legitimacy to a very real God, not of any other religion, a God of the Bible. There is no other thing, no other false religion or cult out there that has prophecy fulfilled the way that the Bible does. The Bible's prophecies, if you look at the odds of them happening, are astronomical. They could not mathematically happen unless there was a God behind it. The God of the Bible, who has given prophecy and then seen that prophecy fulfilled to the letter. Those fulfilled prophecies give credence to the fact that all of the end times events are going to be true. You can count on them. The end times events, just the prophecy of the rebirth of Israel and the dry bones events of Ezekiel 36 and 37 give enough credence to this being real. Take it seriously. If you are listening to this study and you don't know the God of the Bible, if you don't know Jesus, his son, who came to die on the cross for you, you need to get to know him. because if you don't know him before these events unfold, it will be too late. There will come a point in time that there will be no opportunity for decision. Right now, we will be in that valley of decision that the Bible so clearly talks about, the valley of decision that we have to make with God. Israel will come to that valley of decision. It will be the time that they will have to repent and accept Jesus, or it will be too late for them. There will be a significant number of people in the end times that come to faith because they will see things like this, things like prophecy that is unfolding before their eyes, exactly how God said, and it will cause them to come to faith. They will realize God is real, God is true, and I better take everything that he says seriously before it is too late. Well, we've covered Ezekiel 36, 37, and 38. Now we're going to get into Ezekiel 39. So let's jump in to Ezekiel 39 and just walk through as much as we can get through of this chapter here for our study this afternoon. Just a reminder, as we get into Ezekiel 38, God is the one who said, I will do this. Now, this is the picture of the ultimate, really, what could be the beastly empire. I believe this is probably pretty likely that this is the beastly empire. It's not a revived Roman Empire in the sense of the Western Roman Empire. It's a revived Eastern Roman Empire, with the Ottoman Empire being the center of this. The Ottomans took over the Eastern Empire really from the Romans. The Romans had organized this and had this as their Eastern Empire, and the Ottomans took this over. The Eastern Empire would consist of really these countries that you see. Now, Ezekiel points out the regions, the ancient regions of what these places are. So we have the places of Magog. We have, and remember in it, it's referred to as Gog of Magog. Gog is just ruler of. This is the Antichrist. He's Gog. He's also known as the prince of, well, some places it's the Prince of Rosh. Other places it's going to be referred to just as this prince, but that is the Antichrist in this scenario. So we have Magog. Now, what's Magog? That is the Stan nations. We have there Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Afghanistan, Pakistan, which is not in green, but it should be in green because it's a very growing, powerful Muslim nation. We have the countries of Meshach, which consists of Tubal, Gomer. It's going to consist also of this place called Togarmah, or Beth Togarmah. Beth just means house. So we have Meshach, Tubal, Gomer, and Togarmah. Now, what are these? These are all modern-day Turkey. So these are the Turkey countries. What is modern-day Turkey today? And then you have the area of Persia, which is Iran. You have the areas of Kush, which is really the Sudan, and Ethiopia could be the modern days area of Kush. And then you have Put, which is going to be Libya, Algeria, primarily. So these are the areas in the region. Now, some versions, the King James Version, the New King James Version, bring in Rosh. They will say the Prince of Rosh, and that could be modern-day Russia. Now, that's a unknown. It's not really sure, but what we see here is a potential of the 10-nation coalition, or the 10-nation confederacy, which is what the book of Daniel talks about. And we studied the book of Daniel. Go back and watch those if you're not familiar with Daniel. 10-nation coalition, which really could correspond with these different regions. So you have these areas of Turkey, Iran. You potentially could have Syria, Jordan in there as well. Lebanon could be in there, but it's maybe not. They could just be taken over, very likely as well. But you have these countries, these probably 10 countries, which you look at the Stan nations in Pakistan, Iran, Turkey, the Put areas of Libya, Sudan, possibly a couple of others in there, and you have your 10-nation coalition. Now look where they're all positioned on this map coming against Israel. So if you look here, they are all positioned so that when they come against Israel, they will be coming at Israel. Let me use a different color there. They'll be coming at Israel from every direction. So look at this. They're coming from the north, south, east, and west against Israel. And again, Israel is just this tiny little postage stamp size nation, but they are in the crosshairs of this coalition of nations. And again, what sets them apart is these are all Muslim nations, and the radical Muslims, the ones that are the absolute committed Muslims following what they believe is the holy war, the holy jihad, the ones that are committed to the revived Ottoman Muslim Empire, these are all nations that have a significant hatred of Israel. They hate Israel with a passion. Not every person in the country does, but the ones that will be ruling the country and the ones that will be taking control in that country, they have a tremendous amount of hate toward Israel. They want them wiped off the map. So again, with that background in mind, let's jump back into 39. So at the beginning of chapter 39, starting in verse 1, here's what it says. God says to Ezekiel, he says, "You son of man." So again, that's a reference that he is referring to Ezekiel. You, Ezekiel, I want you to prophesy. So again, the prophecy is the future events. Say what's going to happen in the future events against Gog. Now again, remember who Gog is, because we've been talking about this a lot, but say that's the Antichrist. Say against the Antichrist and say, "Thus says Adonai Elohim, behold, I am against you, Gog, chief prince of Meshach and Tubal." Again, it's just a reference to ruler. He's Gog of Magog, chief prince of Meshach and Tubal. So this is just the supreme leader, the leader of the beastly empire. So remember, God is going to use him to bring them against Israel, but God is not for them. God is using them to bring about his purposes the way that he has done in many times. Look throughout the Old Testament and you see examples of this. I will use, God says, the nation of Babylon to come against Israel and for Israel to one day, again, return. He did that to really get a hold of them. Every time they start walking into just idolatry and pagan lifestyles, when they start rejecting God, deliberately disobeying God, God will He will be patient to a point, and then his patience comes to an end, and he will come against Israel. Well, this is the same thing. I'm going to use you, Gog. So if you lay this scenario on top of Daniel's timeline and on top of the timeline of Jesus, and if you lay it on top of the timeline of Revelation, you see these events unfolding. And the events unfolding are really what is referred to as the 7 years of tribulation. So Jesus refers to in the middle of the tribulation. Daniel refers to in the middle. And he talks about this great event that happens called the Abomination of Desolation. And that is an event that happens in Jerusalem itself, in the temple of God, the rebuilt temple of God. But the Abomination of Desolation is the event where the Antichrist has taken control of Jerusalem. He's taking control of Israel. That happens prior to, so that happens in the first 3.5 years of the tribulation. So he takes control of this. Now that's Daniel and Jesus, and Revelation really reveals these events. Now the book of Revelation doesn't lay out the Abomination of Desolation event as much as it does what God is doing from heaven during these events. That really comes in the book of Daniel, and then again Jesus references it in Matthew chapter 24. So God uses Gog and the beastly empire to come against Israel. So he is going to come against Israel. That's what Gog is going to do. Gog will come against Israel, But God is not for him, God is against him. So once he has come against Israel, once God has accomplished what he wants to accomplish, God will turn against Gog and he will actually destroy him. Now, most of that is going to come at the return of Jesus. As Jesus returns, these events are going to unfold. So what will happen? Well, God is going to lead this nation up against Israel. They will come against Israel from all directions. Again, Israel will be at the center of the scenario. They will be coming from the all directions against Israel, this beastly empire. They will be attacking. But when they attack, when they feel like they have started to take control, when they have feeling secure in their attack, God will unleash the wrath against them. So, by the way, the wrath that will be unleashed, the wrath of God that is unleashed, corresponds with the coming of Jesus. Jesus is the one who brings the wrath against them. There are events that take place in the book of Revelation that we're going to look at, and those events are going to be 3 sets of 3. In the 3 sets of 3, there are going to be 3 sets of judgments. There's going to be the judgments that will happen, which will be the seals. The seals will be the prelude. If you look at the seals when we get to the book of Revelation, it really matches up each seal with the things that Jesus says. So that really seems to be happening in those first 3.5 years. Then you have what is called the trumpets judgments that are going to happen. And then you have these things called the bowls of wrath. The bowls of wrath really take place at the wrath of God when God is coming against this Antichrist nation. So look what he's going to do. He is going to let them really attack Israel, do the abomination of desolation, take up their foothold and stronghold in Israel, but then God will have them in the mountains of Israel, and God will strike the bow. He will knock the bow out of the left hand of Gog. In other words, he's going to come against Gog and just incapacitate him. He's going to make the arrows of Gog just fall from your right hand. So just picture somebody standing there, the bow is knocked out of the hand, the arrows just fall out of the hand, meaning all of the power and the influence that Gog had, the Antichrist had, God is just going to wipe it away from them. He says to them, and he says, this is to the Antichrist, you will fall in the mountains of Israel, you, all your troops, and the people who are with you. So all of these Muslim nations that are coming against Israel from every direction, thinking they have won, God will intervene. It will be an impossible situation until God intervenes and he brings the wrath of God, unleashes the 7 bowls of wrath upon them, completely destroys them, and he says, you will fall on the mountains, you and your troops and all your people, and I will utterly destroy you. There's pictures in the book of Revelation of Jesus being this conquering hero with blood-soaked garments as he comes as a destroyer. And God says to the Antichrist, he says, I will give you as food to all kinds of birds of prey and of the beasts of the field. So you're going to all be killed, lie in the field, and birds are just going to come, and animals are just going to come and feed upon your flesh as you are lying in the fields everywhere. You will fall, God says. You will fall on an open field. This final battle, for I have spoken. And notice the words that God uses, and these are always a cool phrase. It is a declaration of Adonai. So God says this, I have declared it. It is a promise. There is a certainty. It is certain. It is going to happen. It is true. These are the events that you can look forward to. So think about the events. You have this gathering of this nation, this coalition of this beastly empire, Muslim nations that are going to come against the nation of Israel. They come against Israel when Israel feels the most secure. They overrun Israel. According to Daniel and Jesus, they do this abomination of desolation event. This is right at that 3.5 year mark. They do this event. They have taken over. They have just utterly destroyed what's going on in Israel. Jesus says, "Woe to you who are in Israel, flee. Don't even look back. Don't take your coats. Don't take anything with you. Just flee and hope that it's not on the Sabbath. Hope that it's not in the winter time. Because if it's the Sabbath, the Orthodox Jewish people will cause a just massive chaos because they won't go anywhere. And if it's in the winter, it can be cold in the Israel, especially in the desert or the mountains. It's going to be cold, so hope that it's not on that day. Woe to those who are in Israel who are nursing and with child, because it's going to be a burden to be able to do that. It's going to be hard to be able to do this. He says this is going to happen. The Antichrist and the beast will come against Israel, and then God will intervene. And when God intervenes, he will utterly destroy the Antichrist's empire, all of the people that came, all of the army, leave them as dead. The beasts of the field will feast upon them. The birds of the sky will feast upon them. And God says, this is my declaration. This is what is going to happen at the end times. Let's keep going through this, and then I want to pull in the book of Revelation just a little bit and give you the foreshadowing of what we're going to be talking about in the coming weeks as we walk through the book of Revelation together. Verses 6 through 8 of 39, God says, he keeps going, and he says, I will send fire on Magog and on those who live securely in the islands, then they will know that I am Adonai. So notice what he had just said. He was going to destroy the army and all of the people that came into Israel to fight against Israel, the army that was attacking Israel. And so that was the Antichrist, that was the army, and any of the people that were connected. But now he doesn't stop there. God says, and I will also send fire on Magog and those who live securely in the islands. So that is the fire on the lands that they have come out of. Maybe it's in particular the Magog lands, which we looked at as being the Stan nations and the islands associated, people who are living securely in the islands. But the whole ultimate picture is that they will know that I am Adonai, so that they will know I am Adonai. So now again, remember, we often think that the end times events are going to be the entire world. Now, notice that the end times events are not necessarily the entire world. The end times events are focused on the Mid-East area, region. That's where the end times events are focused on, because that's the area where Israel is at. And again, they will come against Israel from every direction. They will be coming against God's people from every direction. This is the area that is going to be where the battles are going to occur. This is the most heated areas in the world that these events are going to happen. Now, this is the focus, the Middle Eastern region, but the rest of the world will be engaged in a way in this. People will either be siding with this beastly empire, or they will be siding against the beastly empire. But the world will be caught up in this because God's wrath, the wrath of God, the bowls of wrath that God will pour out, and the trumpets that will be blown, and I would even throw in there the seals that will be broken. All three of these events in Revelation the world will feel the impact of all of these things. But just remember that the Middle Eastern region is the area where all of these events are really unfolding and occurring. That doesn't mean it's going to be easy here. It doesn't mean that it's going to be problem-free. We will have our own problems that we are dealing with, our own persecutions. The United States probably will be very divided, much like it is today, but even more so. And the United States will be more in league with this beastly empire. You'll see more people jumping on the bandwagon with this beastly empire. In fact, you will probably see factions of the beastly empire popping up all over the country, and it will grow with power. There's also the possibility, and I've heard many people speak about this in a prophetic sense. Whether it's true or not, we don't know. People can say all kinds of things prophetically, but you don't ever know if they're true or not. But the United States will be undergoing its own, and I'll just write it up here, the U.S. will be undergoing its own type of judgment because of our wickedness, and especially if we turn against Israel at any point. And so the judgment could be many ways. The judgment could be financial. There could be a financial collapse. There could also be a famine. We know that those are the things that Jesus warns about. There could be great famine. There could be great persecution of people turning upon one another, persecution against Christians in our country that could heat up to an intensity that we have never seen before in our country for sure. That could absolutely happen. And then there could be just the physical phenomenons of earthquakes, volcanoes, tsunamis. There could be events like that that are unfolding, which could be that could unfold, which could be the physical events that are going to be happening. So just because the Middle East is the region of these events doesn't mean that the rest of the world will escape. It means that it will be different in those places. When God's wrath, when the trumpets are blown and the seals become broken, the whole world will feel those events. The battle itself will ultimately be the Middle Eastern region, the Middle Eastern battle. That's where that will occur. So God says, I'm going to do this after I have destroyed the army and the Antichrist. I'm going to pour out fire on the lands that they're coming from so that they will know that I am Adonai. There will be no mistaking who God is. He will show himself. The only way that they won't know he's God is if they deliberately decide that we will not listen to the warnings and we will just deny. We'll blame this on something else. We'll blame it on climate change. We'll blame it on Israel itself. We will blame it on something that we're not even expecting. We'll find a way to blame so that we don't have to give God the credit. But God will pour it out so that there should be no excuse for them. So God goes on to say this. He says, "So I will make my holy name known." This idea that God wants us to know him. This is the common theme throughout Scripture. God has revealed himself to mankind so that we will know him. And God says, I will make myself known among my people Israel. So now Israel will have the option to repent. God says, I will make myself known before my people Israel. And he says, I will not let my holy name be profaned anymore. I won't let people say anything against me anymore. God has been slow to anger. He has been full of patience. He's been abounding in loving kindness for centuries and centuries. But God will finally say, no longer, my holy name will no longer be profaned. People will not speak against my holy name. He says, the nations will know that I am Adonai, the Holy One in Israel. Behold, it is coming. Again, let's just note this. Behold, it is coming. It will be done. It is a declaration of Adonai. Again, it is a promise. It is certain. This is the truth. This is a guarantee, God is saying. This is going to happen. It will happen. This is the day I have spoken about. So now what is that? What is he talking about here? This is the day that God has always been leading to. The end. The day of Jesus's return. This is the day God has always been pointing to. The whole world will come to a crux at that point. When Jesus returns, when the Lord returns, and we have seen this idea that when the Lord returns, there has been a series of about 6,000 years from the beginning of creation now. When the Lord returns, Jesus will set up his 1,000-year millennial reign. The Jewish people have often believed that each 1,000 years represents 1 year, or could represent one day. So if you look at God's creation, God created in 7 days, which could correspond easily to the 7,000 years. If you look at the fact that God created on 6 days, and then on the 7th day he rested, 1 day of rest, that would correspond to 6,000 years being the 6 days, and the 1,000-year millennial reign is the 1 day of rest. And then what happens after that? Well, that is then what's called the New Jerusalem, the new earth, and the New Jerusalem, those two things that are going to happen. And this is the starting over. This is the new creation. When does the new creation begin? It begins on day one after the 1,000-year millennial reign of Jesus. So God says, this is the day that I have been leading to. This is the day that I have spoken about. It's going to happen. It's coming. It's a declaration. If you believe God, if you believe in who he is, if you understand the prophecies that have already been fulfilled, then when God says it's a guarantee, you can take it as a certainty. As a believer in Christ, you should make sure your heart is prepared and that you are engaging with people around you to warn them and to share with them before it is too late. There will come a day again when it is too late and there's no more opportunities that they will have to repent and decide to turn to Jesus. Let's go to verse 9. The inhabitants of Israel's city. Now this is after the Lord's return. This is after the battle is done and the Lord has had his wrath. The inhabitants of Israel's cities will go out. So whoever is left, whoever is trusted in the Lord, who has survived and has trusted in God, they will go out and they will kindle fires. What will they make the fires from? All of the weapons that are left in the fields. Now, Ezekiel says it's the shields, the breastplates, the bows, and the arrows, but we can think of those as metaphors. Really, it's going to be it's going to be the tanks, it's going to be the artillery, it's going to be the weapons, it's going to be the whatever. It's going to be all of the military gear will be on fire, burning everywhere. If you've looked at pictures in military campaigns past, you've seen these kind of scenes where all of these things are just burning up in the field. They can't be used anymore. We don't want them to be used anymore. They just are set on fire. They will have so many. They will have so many fires that things will burn for the next 7 years following this. Think of the massive size of the military army that is coming against Israel, that there is so much left in the fields that they will be lighting them on fire and burning them down for 7 years. They will not take wood out of the field or cut anything from the forests. All they're going to do is they will make fire, notice, from the weapons. So that they're not adding to these fires, they're just burning what is already there in the field. They will plunder those who plundered them, and they will loot those who looted them. So Israel, the survivors, will go out and they will burn all of the equipment and they will take loot of the people who came, remember, to loot them. That was the motivation for this Antichrist, the beastly empire. They wanted to destroy Israel and they wanted to loot Israel because Israel had something that they did not have, which in my opinion, my thinking with it is going to be there will be great famine and they will look at Israel and Israel will have plenty. And they will say Israel has plenty. Now that could be plenty of food. That could also be plenty of oil. That could be plenty of natural gas. That could be plenty of technology, and they will look at them and they will say, I want to loot them. And in their greed, God destroying them, Israel will come and loot them in the fields instead and take whatever of value that they could possibly have. Again, notice this. This is such an important thing. I would encourage you just to circle this or underline it every time you see it. He says it is a declaration of Adonai. God says this is a guarantee. It's what's going to happen. These are the events that are going to unfold. I guarantee it. These are the things that you need to be watching for. Well, keep going. Verse 11. On that day, I will give Gog a burial place there in Israel, the valley of the travelers east of the sea. It will block those who travel through, since they will bury Gog and all his multitude there. So there will be something between the sea. Now, if you look at a map of Israel right there on the coast, that the land kind of looks something like this. It kind of looks like a stocking of some kind, but you see, he says that there will be a valley of travelers east of the sea. So there will be a place that they will bury them somewhere. Then they will call it the Valley of Hamon Gog. That's where they're going to bury him. Now, in the book of Revelation, the way that the events unfold in the book of Revelation are these. In the book of Revelation, you have, first of all, you have the 7 seals. You then have the 7 trumpets. At the end of the 7 trumpets, on the final trumpet, is where you see God doing the rapture. That's the event that you see. It's pretty clear if you look at the book of Revelation. In the book of Revelation, this is in Revelation chapter 14. This is where the rapture occurs, and it occurs after the 7 trumpets, after the 7 seals. It occurs at the final trumpet. We'll look at that as we get there. It's in Revelation chapter 14, and it is the final trumpet where the Lord harvests the earth. The entire earth is harvested at that time. After that happens, then you have the 7 bowls of wrath. The 7 bowls are the time where God pours out his wrath upon the world. At the end of those 7 bowls of wrath is where you have what is called the judgment of Babylon. Now, Babylon is going to be a phrase that will be used. Now, Babylon is modern day Iran, but it was really the area of that Babylonian Empire, which is going to be the picture of the beastly empire. There's the judgment of Babylon. At the end of the judgment of Babylon, that's when the Antichrist is destroyed. And in fact, it talks about in that judgment of Babylon that there will be, after this judgment, there will also be this great final battle. The final battle, it says, of this age, the final battle. And that's really, I believe, in my opinion, what we are looking at in all of these battles. At the end of the judgment and the end of the final battle, that's when you see the destruction of the Antichrist thrown into this great fire. You see all of that beginning to happen. Well, that is also going on right here. So these events correspond, that you have after the judgment, after the final battle. That's where you have the Antichrist finally being destroyed. And that happens in the book of Revelation, and that's what we will get to. So what will happen? Verse 12, the house of Israel will bury them for 7 months in order to cleanse the land. So picture having to bury. So here's what we've seen. That we've seen the animals and the birds of the beasts of the field, the birds of the air eating on the flesh of all of those that are dead. The weapons are being burned for a period of 7 years, and we are collecting bodies and burying them, and it's going to take 7 years in order to cleanse the land. All the people of the land will bury them. So this is going to be an incredible work, the entire land of Israel. So think of the number of people that will be killed, the number of soldiers, the army, the beastly empire that will be killed, the number and the size of this, in the millions that will be killed. So much so that it's going to take 7 years for those surviving in Israel to go out and bury them. This will be memorable for them, a day when I am glorified. So all along, God is being glorified through what he is going to do when he pours out his wrath, when he pours out the judgment, and when the final battle occurs. Again, what does God say? He says one more time, it is a declaration of Adonai. So what does that mean? It is a promise It is a guarantee. It is going to happen. It is a certainty. This is the truth. That's what this idea of declaration is. God says this is what's going to happen. So be watching for these events. As we get into the book of Revelation, we're going to see all of these events really corresponding. So think about what we have learned in all of this study of Ezekiel, in the study of Daniel, and in the study of the book of Matthew, verses 20 or chapters 24 and 25, well, 24, 25, and 26. As we have looked through all of those, what have we seen? Well, we have seen these timelines in the book of Daniel. Daniel's timeline is really about the beastly empire. The beastly empire is rising up. The beastly empire comes to power. It is going to be a beastly empire that's going to consist of 10 nations, and that will be, they will come against Israel when Israel feels at peace. As we have looked at the book of Ezekiel, and we've seen thus far in the book of Ezekiel, we have seen the timeline really on the nation of Israel. We've also seen the timeline as God lays out. So he lays out of Israel, you have its destruction, you have its rebirth, which happened about, 2,000 years later. Then you have its, not only its rebirth, but you have Israel flourishing. Then you have Israel in peace. Then you have the Antichrist beastly empire from Daniel coming against Israel. That's what we've seen in Ezekiel. If you look at the book of Matthew, in the book of Matthew, Jesus's timeline, he talks about the events that will happen prior to the Abomination of Desolation, prior to the mid-time, and he talks about what will happen after that. But he's focused primarily on this, and he's focused on the events that happen leading up to this. You will see deception happen. You will see famine happen, wars, rumors of wars, nations rising against nation. That's ethnos. That's ethnic groups rising against ethnic groups. You will see great persecution. You will see earthquakes. All of these events. Luke adds in the pandemics, the pestilences that you will see. So that's Jesus's timeline. The book of Revelation is really the heavenly timeline, what you see, the events that are happening in heaven during all of this. And so that's the book of Revelation. We'll show you these events that are going to take place. So I think that that's a great stopping point for us today, right there at the end of Ezekiel 39. I'm hoping that all of this is making sense, and I'm not confusing the issues for you. Again, just in summary, we are going to see the rebirth of Israel. That's happened. We will see Israel starting to feel peace. We see the events of that happening. We see the foundation stones being laid for the events of peace that could possibly happen. We are going to see the birth of, well, not the birth, the rebirth of the beastly empire. It was a nation or a confederacy that was, and then it was not, and then it was again. What is that? My opinion, that is the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire was, it was not in 1919, and then it will come again. 1919 through 1921, it ceased to be. So the Ottoman Empire was gone. It was, and then it will come again. The revived Ottoman Empire, the revived Muslim coalition. They will come against Israel when Israel is feeling peace. When Israel feels peace, they come against them. They will think that they have won. God will step in, utterly destroy every one of them. They will lie dead in the fields, so much so that it will take 7 years for the cleansing to occur, whether it's fires burning up the equipment or them just being buried. It's going to be a massive amount of people that will die in this final battle that will occur as Jesus returns, brings forth his wrath, sets up his 1,000-year millennial reign, and then after that 1,000 years, the new heaven and the new earth will be created, and that will be an incredibly spectacular thing that we will see, and it's all covered in the book of Revelation. So we will pick it up there in Ezekiel chapter 39, verse 14 next week. As always, thank you so much for joining me. For those who have stuck around to the end of this, I appreciate you giving me your time. And again, I hope this was helpful. I hope that you gained some knowledge out of this, and I hope that you are looking at the events that are happening as we see these things unfolding, and you start seeing it through a biblical lens, because these events are before us in the very near future. Thanks. Have a wonderful rest of your day, and I will see you back here next week as we jump into verse 14 of Ezekiel chapter 39. Until then, have a wonderful, wonderful week.